It's 2 o'clock, and I think that we should begin our first Friday Story Hours. Maggie and Steve Mullins, who are the coordinators for the program, are at the Florida Storytelling Camp this weekend. So they asked me to come down and introduce Ernie. Maggie and Steve have been coordinating the program for about a year and a half. Pat Allen requested that they do that, and so it's been very successful. And we're very pleased to have you come back month after month. And the way the program works is I will introduce our featured speaker, and then he will speak for maybe a half hour, and then the last half of the hour is open to you. And if you have been inspired or would like to come up and maybe tell a joke or tell a story, a personal story, a folk tale, anything that you feel like sharing with the group, why, that's what the last half of the hour is for. And so that always adds to our enjoyment. So if you have the courage, and I don't think that'll be a problem, but we do want you to do that. There are plenty of seats around, some up front here, some on the side. There are also chairs over there. I just want to tell you about these magic chairs. At the end of the program, they have to disappear back into these little racks and just line themselves all up. So what we do is we just leave 15 chairs here, and the rest of them magically stack themselves up. So if you can be little elves and help with that, we appreciate that. If you saw the picture of Ernie in the paper, it was a good one. And I think Maggie wrote, which I think is terrific, Ernie seems to have the gift of seeing with wondrous humor the little quirks and oddities of all of us, and our very human attempts to appear as though we knew what we were doing. So Ernie he's going to be talking about true confessions of a preacher man's son. He said he wasn't going to mention anything personal, but his bio, he went to college in Wisconsin, then he went to theology school in Minnesota, and he was also a preacher man himself. Then he's been also the administrative head of a large retirement center. He and his wife Nina have been on Sanibel for the past 14 years. I'm sure most of you in here know Ernie. And he's served at the local church as well as being on the Sanibel Planning Commission and president of the library board. So Ernie, you're a happy spirit, full of good sense and good humor, and a fine storyteller. Ernie Klaudt.
You heard the proposed title of this presentation, True Confessions of a Preacher Man's Son. However, people that write bios for you, that make presentations to the media, are not always filled with exactitude. And somehow in that bio information of mine, that the gurus of this story or the Mullins presented to the news, an insertion was made that I knew General Custer personally. Well, I think I look pretty good for being 89 years old. I'm not 140. But so I'm going to add an addendum to my talk. I'm going to take off on the Indian factor and knowing Custer. Now, most of you know, of course, that George Custer met his demise in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. There were two groups at the Little Bighorn in the battle. There were the Scalpies and the Scalpers. Now, some members of my family were not amongst the Scalpies. They were the Scalpers. They survived. Now, the story of the battle is this, and this is not always written fulsomely and accurately in history. Sitting Bull, the medicine man of the Hunkpapa tribe of the Sioux, he was ticked off, I could use a better word, and all the Indians were too, because the white men broke every treaty they made, they stole the land, they kept on coming, they robbed the Indians, and finally Sitting Bull decided to unify all the Indian tribes, not to conquer the white army or the white nation. There were too many of them, you couldn't do that. But he was thinking like Farrakhan. You know, the million-man march, let's get as many together as we can and impress them, you know. stage our protest. So they all assembled in the valley of the river, the little bighorns, and the medicine men were up on the hilltop, including one of my relatives, and they were making medicine. You know, you dance and you prance around and you smoke and you rattle your magic rattles and all that kind of thing. And they knew Custer was coming, but nobody ever dreamt that idiot would attack. So there they were, hoping for a peaceful confrontation. All of a sudden, Sitting Bull says, "My God, he's attacking." Well, in 20 minutes, it was all over. You know, Custer rode down into the valley of the shadow of death, and there he met the slings and arrows, not of outrageous fortune, but the slings and arrows of damn mad Indians. And 20 minutes later, it was done. And at that point, the medicine men, including one of my relatives, said, "We're out of here." You know, they knew it was all over. Sitting Bull took members of the tribe and went up to Canada. My forebear, he just disappeared very conveniently. And he finally, down in the Dakotas, he met a Jewish peddler, a German Jewish peddler, by the name of Goldwasser. And this peddler wasn't doing very well. He couldn't speak Sioux. He could speak German. There were a lot of German settlers, but he wanted to sell stuff to the Indians. So we met this likable, light-skinned Sioux Indian. Apparently there had been a little hanky-panky there, so he was whiter than most, whiter than most Sioux. And they set up a partnership so he'd have a translator. And they established a trading post. It was known as the Sioux and the Jew.
Oh, it's on tape, Bernie, let's get our tape
I
on
forgot.
here.
I brought the paper.
Start
over.
She'll have it on. She'll have it on.
Okay.
Here, I forgot to do that. Well, two of them forgot to use it. Well, that's typical of a Klaudt family. We Indians are not too proficient when it comes to mechanical things. Well, anyway, they started this partnership, and it didn't work very well. The only good thing that came out of it, my forebear, of course, couldn't read or write. And the German Jew could, so we taught him how to read and write. The only problem was the German Jew only knew German, so here you have this case of England who became literate in German. And finally, of course, the partnership broke up, and Goldwasser went down to Phoenix, Arizona, and he started a trading store. He also changed his name, and one of his grandsons became a U.S. senator and candidate for president. Meanwhile, up in the Dakotas, my forebear, you know, he was smart to begin with. I mean, most of us are. That's why he was a medicine man. You know, medicine man was a combination of a healer, an MD, and a clergyman. He did both, all in one person. Well, as my forebear looked around, what am I going to be now? I'm no longer in the trading post. I have to make a living. And he never did go for that hunting and fishing bull and all that kind of stuff, you know, playing golf and so on. He was not physically active, you know. His Indian name, that they used to call him Bone Lazy, and all that kind of thing, nasty names. And so he looked around, and what profession can I enter? He now was literate. Well, the doctors appealed to him. They had white jackets and they had something hanging around their neck, and some of them had a light on their forehead, and they looked impressive. And but he soon discovered, my gosh, they have to go out at night, make calls and go through the blizzards and the snow. You know, that's not for me, you know. And so he turned to the religion side of the thing. He met the missionaries of the Catholic Church. Now that looked good. They had beautiful robes and things on the head and some mysterious kind of water they had, and they did very strange thing at an altar. You know, the thing was filled with mystery, and he said, boy, that's for me. Then he found out they couldn't marry. Well, you know, being a good Sioux Indian, he couldn't imagine living in a household with nobody to do the hard work and the heavy lifting. So he, there's nothing left but the Protestant ministry. So that wasn't quite as glamorous as good, but at least there was somebody to do the heavy lifting and so on. And so he became involved, and now, but he needed a name.
You know, you couldn't go in the ministry with a name like, well, the real Sioux name, you know, the Sioux names always described you for what you were. It wasn't just a name like Ernest or Herman or George or something. It had to have relevance to who and what you were. And the real name that they usually called them, at least amongst other people, was he who is so lazy, he stinks as though he were already dead. You know, and very descriptive. You know, it's the Sioux language. I don't want to, if any of you are too effete to listen to this, it's time to go. But let me give you a few examples of the Sioux language and the way they named each other. One of the people was called he whose breath smells like a wolf's rectum. They didn't use words like rectum, they had more refined ones. And they had another one which I always enjoyed, he who plays with himself. And I imagine if you met him formally, you'd call him masturbator. So he had to have a name, and he found he married a woman, her name, Hermina Klaudt. So he adopted her name, and that's how the family name came about. And so there are Klaudt Indians all over the West, and this group, they stayed with the tradition of being medicine men, either clergymen or doctors. And this group again, the father, Helmuth, which in German means happy boy, good-natured, etc. They always try to choose names when you enter from pubescence into puberty. It was decided that your personality was already formed. And so he was a happy kid, and they called him Helmuth, and he eventually went to seminary with the Church of God, and he married, and they formed this singing group. My Indian name, of course, was Truth Teller, because they learned early. It was obvious from when I was a little boy that I spoke nothing but the truth and the facts and nothing but the facts. Now, so much for the Indian part. Now to get to the gist of what or the reason why I'm here to speak about PKs. Are there any preacher's kids in the audience? Okay, out. Preachers' kids are a peculiar breed. They tend to identify with one another, and they've had some common experiences. If you watched or listened to football games, Danny Werfel, the Heisman Trophy winner for the University of Florida, his father's a minister. And these idiotic sportcasters, every time Danny passed the ball or ran or did this or did that, and the preacher man's son does this, and the preacher man's, you know, what the devil did the preacher man's, the fact that he's a preacher have to do with it. But you are, as a preacher's kid, you are marked with what I call the mark of Cain. You know the biblical story, Cain killed Abel, and God put a mark on him to warn people, don't touch him, but he is Cain, the brother killer, and so on. So you are a PK. I thought sometime I'd get old enough to outlive it, but not too many years ago when I was chairman of the planning commission, we had an issue that involved environmentalists. And I'm not the greatest tree hugger in the world by any means. And I cast a vote which thoroughly enraged one of our more rabid environmentalists on the island. And she happened to know my background. She didn't know I was a clergyman, but she knew my father had been a minister. And so she came charging up to the dais during the intermission and said, with great contempt in her voice, "And you're a minister's son." Now, what the minister's son had to do with the way I cast my vote, I'll never know, but this is part of the framework of the thinking. If you're a minister's son, you are expected to behave a certain way, either good or bad. If you behaved as a good little boy, yes, you were a real minister's son. If you were bad, you know what the reputation was that minister's sons and daughters had, you know. And I preferred not to disappoint people, so I was usually trying to be as bad as I possibly could. You know, I always had this insane desire to please people. I was born in North Dakota, and my father was a clergyman. He served 6 churches, prairie churches, probably the largest of which seated 35 or 40 people scattered across the prairies. And then my mother died, and I was about 2, and my grandparents took me in. They lived in South Dakota. They were farmers or ranchers, call it what you will. And so from about the age of 2 to 5, I lived in hog heaven. I lived on this big farm. We had animals galore. I had 6 adoring uncles and aunts, the youngest of whom was only 5 years older than I was. I had 2 doting grandparents. Everything was wonderful. And it was a very happy time, even though my mother had died. But one of my great recollections of that experience was in the fall after the wheat harvest. The wheat had to be taken to town to the elevators. And so every day for quite a few weeks, there were 6 wagons, each pulled by 2 horses. Each wagon held 50 bushels of wheat, and they drove the 3 miles into town to the elevator. 2 of the hired men, 2 of my uncles, 3 of my uncles, I think, and Grandpa. And they'd make 1 trip in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. And my grandmother, of course, got sick and tired of having this kid around the house all the time. So on one of those trips, she said to Grandpa, "Take it." So I went in the wagon, we rode to town. And you know how a kid can ask questions, you know, very important questions. Why does the sun shine? How come the wind is blowing? You know, all this kind of stuff. And Grandpa was very patient on the way in. But on the way out, he became a little testy. And he was a very large man. In fact, one of the dimensions of his, I remember he had a size 19 neck. I only reached 18 and a half in my prime. I never quite reached proportions of my grandfather. But I kept on asking questions. He asked me to shut up. He was a very silent man. He spoke fluent German, some Russian. He was a German-Russian immigrant from Germany, from Russia. He spoke a little Norwegian because we had Norwegian neighbors, and just a smattering of English. You didn't need to know English out there in the prairies because all the people were from Europe, someplace or another. And so finally he said, "You know, if you don't stop talking, you have to walk home." I kept on talking and asking questions. So there was a lane coming into the farmhouse about a half a mile long. We were down the lane a little ways. I asked one more question. He says, "Get off." Well, there was nothing to do but to get off the wagon. So I got off the wagon and I walked behind. I said nothing. I didn't cry until we got to the barnyard. And then I knew all the while I was thinking, you know, here's a 4-year-old. I'm going to get that guy. You know, he can't do this to me. I'm a special person, adored by grandmother, uncles, and aunts. You don't treat me like this. So I waited till we were within earshot of the farmhouse, and I howled like a banshee. And my grandmother came forth out of the house at great speed, and she ran up to the wagon, and she said to my grandfather, "Why are you making that poor motherless child walk?" I knew what I was doing. I knew she had. And he said, "He talks too much." Get in. So I went. But it had an interesting effect on my life later on as my father remarried when I was about 5, and I moved in with my father and stepmother, which I wasn't particularly eager to do, even though she was a very nice and a most gracious lady. But you know, I was used to being the kingpin, and now suddenly she was it. And I don't think I was there a month, and I decided I'm going to run away. So it was a hot summer day, and I was smart enough to know you needed water. You didn't take off across the prairie without water. So I found a gallon lard can, filled it with water, and took off. I didn't know that my father was watching me. And he called up the street a couple blocks to the banker's daughter, and she's about 16, told her to keep an eye on me. Don't let her see you, but just watch him. So I walked to the edge of town. Now that town only had 300 people. No matter which way you walked, in 3 blocks you were out of town. I got to the edge of town, and that gallon of water weighed about 2 tons at that point. I finally threw in the ditch and came back home. And I didn't tell anybody anything. It was always my secret that I had tried to run away from home and failed. About 7 years ago, I went to a funeral in Phoenix, Arizona, for one of my cousins, a retired UCC clergyman, another one of these Indians who practiced, you know, the medicine man thing. And this woman came up to me and she said, "I'm Emma Litz, remember, from Delmont, South Dakota? The banker's daughter." "Oh, yes, I know Emma." She said, "You remember the time you ran away?" Yeah. There I was again. You can't escape things. But one of the other episodes that I read, two of them that I remember very well. The church, my father still had 3 or 4 churches. The main church, the big church, seated 75 people. It was in town. This town was 300 people. And we little boys always had to sit in the front row. The darn church benches were all something like the Episcopal church in the island. The ends of the pews were buttered up against the wall. And so the elders, when they took the collection of the deacons, they had a bag or a stick, and they passed it in. Well, anyway, we little boys always had to sit in the front row. And the deacons came and they took the offering with the stick and the bag. And I always had a nickel because my father thought as a preacher's son you should set the pace. All the other kids had a penny, which always seemed kind of stupid to me anyway. But as they took the offering, I noticed the old man was sitting there, you know, with a pious look in his face, his eyes shut, you know. The organist was twiddling around on the organ. And I thought, you know, he doesn't see what I'm doing. And I kind of confused him with God anyway. I didn't know him that well. And so I put the nickel in my thumb under my hand, and that bag passed over. I thumbed the nickel, and I kept it. And then the afternoon, I walked up to Divine's drugstore, which was open on Sunday afternoon, and they had the biggest ice cream cone you ever saw. You got it for a nickel. I mean, that thing was just delicious. Well, that went on for quite some time, and then some dirty character ratted on me. And I came home after church, and Dad got me by the neck, and he went through my pockets, and he found that nickel. And you know the old story, "You robbed God," blankly blank, you know. In those days, a razor scrap was considered a great administrative tool for bringing up boys, particularly. And they didn't have Gillette razors, I don't think, in those days. They were straight edges, you know, you'd go like this and sharpen it, and you had a razor scrap about that wide. Well, I'm telling you, I got a taste of that razor scrap. You know, it took about 3 or 4 months before I could even eat an ice cream cone. And also taste for me. But to go back to that story when Granddad kicked me off of the wagon, another Sunday afternoon, you don't know how boring Sunday afternoons were in a little prairie town of 300 people. It was just terrible. No, you know, you couldn't go to a movie, you couldn't do anything, you couldn't play baseball because that was forbidden. And so the neighbors had company. There were 3 cars, all open touring cars like they had in those times. And I noticed they all left their keys in the cars. And I decided, you know, it'd be interesting when those people came out from visiting there to find their keys gone. And, you know, they had a little charm to that Sunday afternoon. So I convinced my neighbor boy, his father was the druggist, Mr. Devine, that we ought to do that. So we did it. And we hid behind some bushes, and pretty soon, exactly what I thought was going to happen, happened. 3 families came out, no keys, a lot of excitement, a lot of discussion, what could have happened to the keys. And then Mrs. Weber, a widow woman who lived across the street, came out. And what I didn't know at that time was that on every street, at any hour of the day, 24 hours a day, 365 days out of the year, there is some woman looking out of somewhere. And you know what she said? She said, "I saw the minister's little boy playing around." Not the druggist's little boy. I saw the minister's little boy playing around the car. So, you know, they got the old man, and he came and he got me, and boy, I knew this is going to be a hard afternoon. So, but I also knew well enough at that time to know that if I could get him to laugh or think it's funny, I might escape. So I came up with the story of my friend Julie and I, we wanted a key tree. And how do you get a tree? You have to plant stuff. So we planted those keys. He bought into that stuff. And, but it convinced me of something, as I became a clergyman, I'm a somewhat a devotee of Calvinistic theology, that man is born in sin, is basically no damn good until he improves and then works on the matter. And years later, when I was in Ann Arbor during the 60s, when the days of the student riots, and I was serving a significantly large church right on the edge of the campus, and the students were trying to take over the campus. They were imitating Berkeley and Columbia, copycat type thing, and the diag at the University of Michigan was filled with students. The poor president of the university, Harlan Hatcher, was out there in his spirit of sweet reasoning, now boys, now girls, and do this and that, and it just got worse and worse, and our redneck sheriff told him to get out of there. He wouldn't, he kept on pleading in his sweet, innocent, academic way, and finally, this is true, absolutely, finally the redneck sheriff kicked his butt. I mean, Harlan Hatcher fell down on his knees, he was kicked so hard. And then the deputies took care of the student right, but they were trying to take over the president's office and move in. And of course, Harlan Hatcher left several months later to become president of Public Network Radio. I think his hemorrhoids were cured by that time. Brought an end to his academic career. Well, anyway, I had the great satisfaction of telling this people in the church one Sunday morning, right after all this, and part of the sloganeering of that time, don't trust anybody under 30. You remember that? Most of you. I told them, you people are incredibly naive. My philosophy is I don't trust anybody over 5. Because I knew what I was before I was 5 years of age. I mean, a pretty devious, untrustworthy, sneaky character that took a lot of improving before things got any better, if they ever did. Anyway, I've been running out of time. I want to talk just for a few minutes about my father, who I think he used to look at me and he'd say, I wonder where you came from. My father was quite a suave, not a delicate person, but he had a little polish and smoothness, and he'd look at me, this lumpy kid, who all he wanted to do was play ball and this and that, and oh man, he had problems, but anyway, he did have problems out in the prairie in those days. Muddy roads, driving out to church. I remember one Sunday morning very vividly, they were going to a church about 20 miles out. It started to rain, a literal cloudburst. They had a type of mud out there called gumbo. I don't know what gumbo is. It's a cruise, you start to get a little mud on your wheel, and then the wheel gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Finally, the wheel can't turn around. There's so much mud adhering to it. Well, he had a patch of gumbo. And he finally got the mud scraped off, he got chains on. Well, by that time, he was mud from head to foot. So there's a water tank that one of the ranchers had and a windmill. I can remember pulling up alongside that water tank, he taking a bath in the horse tank or cattle tank there, putting on his clothes again, which were hardly fit to wear, but that's all he had, and we went on. I mean, that was kind of the life of a clergyman at that time. One night I wasn't with him, but he came home from an evening, whatever it was, one of the elders of the church was with him, and the Dakotas at that time didn't have too many fences. It's something like early Florida. You remember early Florida not too many years ago? It was dangerous to drive at night because no fences, cattle were every place. Well, they were driving along probably at a speed of 10 or 15 miles an hour because the lights on the cars at this time, 22, 23 were almost non-existent. And suddenly the car came to a dead stop. The windshield crashed in. They got out, and there was a dead horse laying across the hood of that old Chevrolet. They caught the horse just between its legs, and the horse died. So they had to back out and pull the horse off, and they went on again. But those were some of the things that happened. My real favorite story concerns my stepmother. They had a wedding in one of these kind of churches, and the little bitty church, the few people that it held were invited to the church, but then they were all invited to the farm. And they had a big dinner and a barn dance, and everything was, you know, great. And everybody had a good time. And then it was traditional that around 7 o'clock, the minister and his family were supposed to know enough to get the hell out of there because the band was coming and the bar dance was going to begin. You know, great fun. And a tragedy happened. Of the three-piece band, 2 showed up. The piano player was sick, couldn't make it. And so old John Brunt, who was about as rough and gruff a man as I ever recall meeting, came up to my father, hat in hand, and asked whether he could stay and let my stepmother play the piano for him. She's one of these people, you know, you whistle a few bars and she could play it. So, and Brunt had always been a superly pietistic fellow, you know, about this type of thing, particularly around the preacher. So Dad said yes. So Elma pounded the piano until midnight that night. She had a great time. Finally, we just had to go home. Of course, I was sleeping in the back seat of the car at that time. I couldn't be up that late. But John Brandt finally came up after it was all over, and he thanked her profusely for what she had done. She had saved the evening. And then he concluded by telling her, and you know, it's just a damn shame that you married a preacher. That was her great reward for the evening. There were many other things. This little town had one notable character. He was an English remittance man. Is there anybody here who knows what a remittance man was? All right, out west, a lot of towns had them. The wealthy English families usually, or quite often, had a black sheep. You know, somebody they couldn't control or whatever, and they would send him over to America, and if he promised to stay there and never come back, they would remit to him every month a check. And the West was filled with remittance men, and we had one in our little town of 300 people. And I think the reason he was there is that the Yankton Indian Reservation was right there, maybe a mile or 2 south of town, and they could have stills, so we had an unlimited supply of liquor there. And he would show up on I think it's the first Tuesday of every month at the post office, dressed up in a black suit, a spoiled collar, I don't know what you call those kind of hats he had, not a derby, but Homburg, yes, a Homburg hat. And he would get his check and then go to the bank next door and cash it. He lived in a little shack on the edge of town. It had 2 rooms, a kitchen and a bedroom. He was constantly inebriated except for that first Tuesday of the month. And there was almost no one to talk to because, again, these early settlements were almost like ghettos. This settlement happened to be almost all German with a smattering of Norwegian. And so there was no one for him to talk to. My father would try to make a point to speak to him when he saw him in town every Tuesday morning at the post office. But you know what a tragic figure this was. Here's this young man, well-educated, living in this solitary prairie community with no communications of any kind except the whiskey bottle, you know. How sad can it get? I have to go on with the one last closing thing was the matter of language. Again, as I say, those communities were ethnic. And consequently, my first language was German. All the church services were in German. Everything was in German. I learned to read and write in German before I learned English. It was just one of those things. And you could literally go through life in many of those communities never needing to know a word of English. My grandfather had 2 German newspapers. There was German books and the whole thing. I'm always amazed today when I read about the English language factor and how difficult it is, you know, and we should cater to the various ethnic groups, etc. Well, frankly, I don't believe it. I went through it, and you know, we got to, so we called it English school. You know, that you had to differentiate between schools. So you went to English school, at 3 months everybody could speak English. There was no problem. The teacher couldn't speak German, but you accommodated and you learned amazingly quickly. So I think I better stop. I've done my half hour.
No, go ahead, Ernie.
Well, let me.
Just keep it on.
Keep it on.
You know, my Indian name is Peace Teller, so I'll keep it down. I'll keep it as honest as I can. When we moved from the Dakotas ultimately to another community, and they had a public school, a true country school, if you can imagine. That was a big school, 2 teachers. And half the kids were Polish Catholic, and the other half were German Protestants. And so we got to this community. And my stepmother was, say, a very sweet woman, but she has certain delusions of grandeur. And she always insisted that I be dressed in little pants and little white shirties and all that gosh. And I'd have to go to school with all these roughneck farm kids dressed in blue jeans. Well, it was a pretty tough go because, first of all, nobody liked the preacher's kids. The Catholics certainly hated him. And the Germans always did have a sort of an animosity against ministers and ministers' sons because of the state church tradition in Germany. You know, you had to knuckle under and bow when you met the minister. So there I was. I think I was about in the 4th or 5th grade. I appeared on the school ground. It was just one fight after another, you know. And I'd come home and blood on my shirt and beat up clothes torn. My poor stepmother would say, "Why must you always fight around?" Well, she didn't have a clue. It wasn't me wanting to fight around. This was a matter of self-preservation. And well, finally, you just did it. And there was one kid who was smarter than I was, the doctor's son. His father had an office sort of diagonally across the road. Well, Norman never went out of the schoolhouse at recess. He always came to school just in time to start. At noon, when he went home for lunch, he was always the first one out of the door, and could that kid run? He went across the street just like a streak, and later on, actually, he made the track team at the university. And I attribute his speed to his early training in this country school. But I was dumb, you know. I went out there in the playground and fought my way through until finally the 7th grade came along. And I had a growth spurt in the 7th grade. And in the 7th grade, that summer, I had whipped all the German kids. We used to have 7 months of public school and 6 weeks then of German school. We were smarter than the average kids. We only needed 7 months of English school. But in German school, they taught us again reading and writing in German, and all the Bible stories and catechism, everything was in German. But there it ran like a public school. My tape recorder ended here. No, the heck with it. I guess somebody else is getting it. Let's see, what's that? Yes, so in German school, we did all these things. We had a recess, and we had noon hour, and so on. And there was always a lot of fighting going on amongst the boys. And I suddenly realized I could take any of those German Protestants, And then I realized, as I looked around, those Polacks didn't look too big and So I could hardly wait for that first day of school in my 7th grade. Boy, I was going to be cock of the walk and king of the hill, and boy, this was going to be great. Well, apparently other kids had seen all this going on. As I entered the school ground, all the Polish kids said, "Hello, Ernie, how are you? So good to see you." They completely disarmed me. I never had the satisfaction of beating up on a single one of those kids. Anyway, but again, my poor stepmother, my heart bleeds for her when we talk about trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. She, because she was an excellent musician and also an artist, she couldn't understand why, first of all, I didn't like music. Some of you wonder why Nina's always at concerts by herself and all that kind of thing. Well, there's a reason. I won't go with her. I suffered enough in my youth. Anyway, so you have to learn how to play the piano. Can you believe 7 years of piano lessons? And I finally won. I still don't know how to play the piano. It's one of my great satisfactions in life. But you know, the poor woman had these delusions about what you can do with kids and how you can make something or somebody into something. They really aren't. So anyway, those were good years. I don't want to live through them again. No way. Then later on, I wound up in the ministry, of course, and just one or two little anecdotes. I think the best funeral I ever had, I used to prefer funerals to weddings. Weddings were just, gosh, all the things, you know. You have a wedding rehearsal, and there was always an aunt there, somebody who's been to a wedding or had a wedding of her own and knows exactly how to do it. And, funerals, you know, much better. So, I had this one funeral of a young man who was killed during World War II. 3 or 4 years later, they found his body and they shipped him back. And we had the services in a little church out in Iowa. And church service then took the casket out to the cemetery. And the family was there and the friends around the grave. And they had chairs there for the old grandma. And the American Legion boys were there with, you know, you'd hear the taps and everybody would, you know, literally collapse with sorrow and the gun would go off. And then as the gun went off, Grandma's chair fell over backwards. And her little 5-year-old grandson said, "Daddy, they got Grandma." And you know, just for a minute, we all thought they did. What happened, one leg of the chair was over a gopher hole. And as the guns went off, she jerked back and over she went. Well, later on, about halfway through my so-called career, I became a healthcare administrator, and those were different years again, and very enjoyable years for me, and let's say it's been a good life. I've enjoyed it. And thank you for listening.
Ernie?
Yeah.
You said your father served 7 churches, I think.
The 6, yeah.
All right, 6. Was that every Sunday, or
No.
or did he?
They would get around, of course, in those early days up north, horse and buggy in the summer and sled in the winter time. And he would, at the most, be able to hit 2 a Sunday. There's one other story. I gotta tell sort of he used to love to tell this story. They had a meeting of the ministers of the Reformed Church. And it's hard to get there by railroad. You'd get to a certain point, then you'd meet others, and then you'd take a buggy and go on to where the meeting was going to be. And they were cutting across the prairie because the roads weren't always a shortcut, but you could go across the prairie. They got to a settler's house, a sod shanty like you had in those days, and it was customary if you got to any habitation around coffee time, you stopped in, you expected to be invited for coffee, which they did, and a young woman came out, and she was carrying a baby, but she was delighted to see somebody. You can imagine how lonely life was out in those prairie areas. And she invited them in for coffee, and they introduced themselves as 4 clergymen of the Reformed Church, German Reformed Church. Yes, I know all about it. I belong to one too. And so it went on, and she went out in the little annex called the kitchen, and she made coffee. And she called back into the main room, which was everything, bedroom, living room, dining room, whatever, and she said, "And how would you like your coffee?" And Dad had seen her pull out one breast. And Dad says, "Make mine black." some of those early pioneer stories were just so great, I never was really in them, but I was close enough to it to listen to the old timers speak, and, I enjoyed them, going in. But some of them were very sad during the great flu epidemic after World War I. You heard about that? People died, literally, just by the dozens and dozens of these isolated farm places and ranches out there. The men in town that were still healthy had to establish routes and go out and milk the cows or let out the horses or water them or, and see whether they could help the families. You go to get to a house, there are 2 or 3 dead people there, and, it was just indescribably bad. And all public meetings were banned. When spring finally came, and you were able to resume public meetings and have funerals, this little handful of people, the 6 churches that Dad served, I don't imagine it had 125 adults between the 6 churches. He had a mass funeral of 29 people. All they could do was just put them outside in the woodshed or someplace like that, in the cold where the bodies froze and preserved. So the years weren't all fun for those people. They were very hard years, and I often wondered how many of them did survive and did overcome. So yes, he was lucky if he had 2 sons. Yeah.
Looking back, you get a feeling that people live to an old age or they die young?
Well, it was sort of a selective process. Some died, I think in my mother's family, my grandfather died at the age of 74, she died at the age of 72. But the next generation, their children, all except my mother and another aunt, they lived into 88, 89, 94. I think it's, now we have medication for high blood pressure and diabetes, you name it, and, but yeah, a few hardy souls did survive. But I think the death rate, go through a cemetery, look at those tombstones, and you're amazed at what you find and see.
What you see is children.
Yes, children. That's sad. I think of all I said funerals were better than weddings, but children's funerals had to be. Children or a young mother, they were the toughest. Any other?
When did you meet Nina?
Well, I tell you.
You remember Nina?
She is a woman I've convinced that it's her that's suffering from incipient Alzheimer, not me. I figure as long as I can convince her of that, I'm in pretty good shape. When she starts disbelieving me, I'm in trouble. Well, my favorite story is when I was in seminary, you had to do field work. And 3 years of academic work and a year of field work, and during the summer they would send you out where you couldn't do any harm. A little country church in Nebraska. What damage could you do? They couldn't afford to have a regular minister, but they wanted somebody there during the summer, so they sent me to one. And there one day while driving down a dirt road, I saw this girl in a dress. You remember those flour sack dresses that they used to make? You buy a 100-pound sack of flour and you get a dress material. And the girl standing alongside the road saying, crying, "I'll do anything to get out of Nebraska." I'll even marry you. Being a good-natured, easygoing kind of a guy, I said, okay.
I'm gonna get you for that.
Yeah. But we've been married now 53 years, 2 children, and 2 grandchildren, and still together. Nobody else wants us. So, so what do you do? Yes.
How long did your father live?
My father lived to be 83. His father died at 57 or 55, getting a stroke, or they called it, they had an interesting name, apoplex. Remember that term, the old timers? Yeah. Yeah. So I think most of us, as we check our family health histories, we will note that there's been a improvement from generation to generation. Although my great-grandfather, my father's father, lived to be 84, 85, which he was a Russian immigrant, German from Russia, who settled on the prairies. And, well, my grandfather came here, the Germans, I don't want to bore you with something. Russia needed people, just like the United States needed people in the early days to settle the West. Well, Russia was the other frontier, and a lot of Germans came and settled in Pennsylvania and so on, we'll call it, Pennsylvania Dutch. There was an equal movement of people from Germany and Central Europe to Russia under Queen Catherine. They had whipped the pants off the Turks and took that whole area around the Black Sea and a big part of the Ukraine, but it was empty. And they wanted settlers, and they wanted good farmers, so they went to Germany, and Germany had just come out of some disastrous wars, it was just terrible. And they promised the people different times of promises changed in different areas. But, my particular family, they were promised freedom from taxes. We're still averse to paying taxes. It's a family tradition, And no military service. They could keep their own language German, and they could live in German enclaves and villages. All this was good for 30 years. No, 60 years at the time they moved there. And my particular family, the day before the 60 years expired, and their young men had to go to the Russian army, which was always a 10-year stint, 10 years, and pay taxes, and become Russianized, they moved over here. Because at that time there was open land out west in 1874.
And the Russians just let them go?
At first they did. They sold their property. They were affluent people. They came over here out west, and by train, they got to the Missouri River, took the steamers up to Yankton, South Dakota, and then went out into the prairies. And that first group were quite affluent. They were able to buy all the machinery and animals and stuff they had. And, in some cases, bought their land. The railroad had free land, but it was not good land, so a lot of them bought their own land. And they did very well. And it's always entertained me in my thinking. My mother's father, he came here late. He was 22 years of age or 23, illiterate, got off at the wrong depot in South Dakota. Conductor kicked him off the train. He didn't know where he was, of course. When you're illiterate, I mean, this is in a strange country. Of course, it doesn't make any difference whether you're illiterate in Poland or America if you don't know the languages, so what? So luckily for him, it was a German community, so he immediately found work, and within a year, he had married the daughter of the man and one of his daughters, and he retired when he was 55. Very affluent, wealthy rancher farmer type. And that was always my goal. My grandfather was my hero, even though he made me walk. Grain wagon. And I got to be 55 and there was no way.
Ernie?
Yeah.
I'm always amazed at how many American families go back to Indian relations.
Yeah.
Mine went back to the Trail of Tears thing, and hers is in Cherokee in North
Cherokee,
Carolina. But her great-grandmother was a Cherokee. Well, all of my Indian relations went west, as big a family of horns out there.
Yeah.
They all had black hair, but I had the Irish side, so I stayed.
Yeah. No hair.
Yeah.
Like me, right? Well, it's an interesting thing, 40 or 50 years ago, you would never admit that you had Indian blood. You didn't talk about it. One of my great memories is the county fair out at Crip, South Dakota. They had a little grandstand and then a racetrack. From the grandstand, they had sulky races and so on. And one of the great events they had there was a great big Buick open touring car. And the big sight was that touring car was gonna run over the leg of an Indian who was laid down the crack and gonna show everybody how brave the Indians are, and he stuck out his leg, and this touring car came at a low speed, was gonna run over his leg. Well, you know, that touring car got within about 2 feet of this Indian, and this cowardly Indian got up and ran like a wolf. And then a great, big, muscled, white guy, blonde hair, blue-eyed, came out, legs about that thick. He lay down and he stuck out his leg, and that same touring car came and drove right over the lake. And he got up and bowed to the crowd, and everybody cheered. But remember, this was about 1924, the Custer Massacre and the Wounded Knee, and all those places were vivid in people's minds. Some of them still had ancestor or parents or grandparents who had been done in by the Indians in their various conflicts. So it took quite a while before you were willing to admit that you were part of a minority. Of course, as Germans and as particularly Germans from Russia, we were always minorities. You know, you didn't mind being a minority. In fact, I also was proud I'm not one of the rabble out there. I'm different.
Are there any more questions for Ernie? Dankeschön.
Oh,
Scrubgrass Township, Butler, Pennsylvania. And not too far from us was a farmer named Jesse Wither. And he was known all around to raise the best hogs. But he always won the blue ribbon at the county fair. And so the other farmers around there decided to send somebody down to find out the secret. So they took Cootie Cassidy, who lived up on the hill, to go down and talk to Jesse and find out what he did special. Well, Jesse says, there's no secret. He said, when them hogs is small, I start and I just tie them at the end of that long pole, and each one of them, I tie one at a time. I hold them up in them oak trees and let them eat the acorns. And got them down and tie the next one on, hold him up and let him eat the acorns. He says, I just go through the whole bunch, then I start all over again. Well, this fellow says, well, that must take an awful lot of time. Oh, yeah, he says, it does. But he says, you know, time don't mean nothing to them hogs.
I'm sure you all know that Bob is not only old,
Aren't we all?
he's blind, he's a war veteran, but he's also an orphan. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.